My journey with disability and with the stroke has been just proving and showing to myself that I am capable of so much more than I thought that I was, and I don't let anything stop me. Society's obsession with Taylor Swift. I simply do not.
And he put me in the swimming pool and I sank to the bottom. Dad looked down and was like, okay, I've got to go get him.
50% chance of it rupturing, and if it did rupture, a 10% chance of death.
Wow.
Today's guest, Madeline Niebanck, is a disability content creator, author, and young stroke survivor. It's a great conversation to have today with Maddi, particularly surrounding her journey when it came to recovery, the difference between our two countries being the US and the UK, and some of her travel stories that she's had over the years, as well as the journey of writing her book. I really do hope you enjoy this episode, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Welcome back to the Not Quite Pod. Today we've got Maddi with us. Maddi, do you just want to quickly introduce yourself, let everyone know a bit about yourself and what you're doing here today?
Sure. Thank you, Charlie, for having me on your podcast. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Maddi. I am a young stroke survivor. I live in America in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. I'm a young stroke survivor. I'm an author. I'm a social media content creator, and I share my experience about traveling with a disability.
Love this. And also, Maddi links in perfectly with one of my obsessions, and that is travel. I love to travel, and I love getting people's different perspectives of what it's like to travel when we have to consider different things that other people may not have to consider. What's one of your favourite places that you visited?
That's a tough question. I think so. Earlier this year, I went to Vietnam for the first time, and that was crazy. It was my first time in Asia. I'd never been to Vietnam, but I had I'm on the board of a nonprofit that does work there, and we had a gala, and I thought I absolutely have to go because this is too good of an opportunity, right? So I got to go to Vietnam, and it was just everything was so different, so good, and the food was incredible.
I must admit,
I think I would say Vietnam.
I'm itching to go to Asia. Thailand's a big one on my list.
I'm going back.
Oh, really? Wow. What time of year are you going?
March. It probably will be early March.
Awesome.
So open invitation.
Yeah, definitely might take you up on that one. What's the country that you found the most challenging when it comes to traveling?
Well, I think it depends, by what mode of transportation. So Chloe, my friend, who I think you know, Charlie.
Yep.
Chloe, who lives in the Netherlands, she and I document our experience of traveling with disability on Disability Travel Diaries platform. And we recently took a train trip through Europe, through a bunch of different places. And that was just very interesting because some train stations were more accessible than others, and some we had better help with the wheelchair than others. There was this little station in France called Tonville. That one was, I'm pretty sure that one was the one where we had a little bit of issues, and it wasn't very clear for most of France, at least in my experience. It's not very clear, where you go if you need assistance. In my mind, that should all just be very clear. Go to this office. It's, right when you enter or something, but it's very much not. And that was just annoying to me.
I have to say, especially when it comes to trains is a very difficult thing when it comes to wheelchair users, because a lot of stations and places aren't equipped to handle people in wheelchairs, but it's crazy that we still have that in
and they go
today's
on
society.
strike.
For example, yes, there's that as well, particularly in London. I live in London. They go on strike all the time. Not to mention the fact of some stations are accessible in London. Some people are more attentive in other places. I always joke on here and say, London's, for those who don't know, London's in the south of England. South of England is known for being sort of the business hub, the main capital. Everyone knows it's that. So everyone's got somewhere to be. That is the issue with London. If everyone's got somewhere to be, someone was supposed to be somewhere yesterday, they're running late. So whenever it comes to helping someone, it is a little bit like almost you ask for support and they're like, oh, you want a ramp to get onto the wheelchair, onto the train? And you're like, yes, that is your job. That is like, that's why you are here.
Exactly.
And they're like, oh, okay. And it's like, why are you surprised by this? And then you go to the north of England and everyone's like, yeah, of course, your train's here in 2 minutes. Don't worry, we'll get you on a train. It's no worries. It's like, it's amazing the different approaches people take. And that's the same when it comes to countries. Countries are, some are better than others, some are more equipped. What's your experience of like living in New York when it comes to public transport? Because I've heard very mixed reviews of New York, and I'm yet to go. It's on my list to go. But what's
you
your
simply
experience in New York?
must. I like from an accessibility standpoint, I know, so you go to any of the subways or train stations in New York and they always have announcements saying like, oh, this is an accessible station. But so apparently every station in New York is technically an accessible station, but it's like, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that because sometimes it's like, oh, but there's no elevator. I don't use a wheelchair, but if I did, like, I don't know how I would get off of the train station or like off of the platform. It's not like always clear, even though they're like all advertised as accessible. I think it's like a little more complicated than that, which is a little annoying. So I think New York has some work to do. But then in other areas, they definitely are good. So.
But I think that's the same as here in the UK. Like the problem is, unfortunately, a lot of places are, some are accessible, some aren't. So you can get off at some stations, you can't get off at others. And the other issue with that is, as a tourist coming here, it's really tricky if you're a wheelchair user. Just because for someone like me who's traveling into London all the time, you start to learn what ones are accessible, what ones aren't, what works, what doesn't work. But then if you don't know that information, it's really hard to then navigate it. And also they don't advertise it very well, kind of like what you said earlier of it should just be very clear and concise, whereas that's not always the case. And then the other issue you have in the UK is that I like to call it, they want to keep hold of the Harry Potter look. That is their big thing of, oh, we can't change this building because we want it to look old fashioned because that's what everyone thinks they're getting when they come to London. And it's like, yes, but I can't get on the train.
Right, but it's not like exactly practical or functional for people to get on board.
But then they're called, I don't know whether you guys have them in America, they are called, here they're called like listed buildings. So they are protected under a certain status to protect the history of the UK. So like the reasons why certain train stations can't be adapted is because they have a certain level of security in terms of how much work can be done in that building, which is really frustrating because there are so many companies now that do retrofitting where they'll make it look the same as the way it looked before, but people, it's one of my big frustrations. But we're going to end up on a very big tangent about trains, and you don't want to set me off on that tangent. No. I will be here for the rest of the evening. What's been your experience of traveling, obviously with your travels with Chloe? Because if I remember rightly, you went to France, Luxembourg, Amsterdam. Where else did you go? I think you went one other place. I can't remember.
We've been to Belgium. We did a road trip through Spain. I've done London, Paris. I also recently took the train from Paris to Geneva because I spoke at the World Health Organization about rehabilitation. And so I got to take the train for that too.
Oh, wow. So what's been your experience of that? So like your whole journey with Chloe and traveling through Europe and speaking at the, what was it? Did you speak at the World Health Organization?
Yes, the World Health Organization.
Crazy. I mean, I'm going to ask you about that after you've asked this question, but I would be so nervous. I would be so nervous.
I don't know, Charlie, if it's because of the stroke. Like, so growing up, before I had a stroke, I was always like into acting and public speaking. So that kind of stuff didn't really make me nervous. It still doesn't really make me nervous after I've had the stroke. However, I can still freeze up, and that kind of happened a little bit when I was speaking there. I think like when I get inside my head, or like it finally dawns, like I just start
Yep.
talking, I'm rambling, and then
Yep.
it suddenly dawns on me
Yep.
like
Yep.
this is a
Yep.
big thing that's happening right now.
Yep. I completely relate to that. It's the exact same thing that happens to me. So I studied performing arts and did drama in school. So being in front of a crowd doesn't faze me. And speaking to people, like I do this all the time. I speak to people come up to me and say hi. That's all fine. Stick me on a stage and say, right, Charlie, speak about this thing that you know loads of things about. Speak about it. And the worst thing is my brain will either go completely blank, or
Exactly.
I'll speak so fast that my brain can't keep up with what information I'm trying to get out, so then I'll lose track of what I'm doing.
Exactly.
So
oh my gosh, I'm definitely the same.
Could not do it. I can imagine as well. I'd imagine in that sort of event you're speaking to medical professionals. It's quite formal.
Countries,
am I right thinking that?
Organizations, all sorts of, like, there were a bunch of different like government leaders from different countries, like the leaders, the health officials in rehabilitation, specialists, different organizations, all sorts of like high-ranking officials and just people.
Whoa.
And it was a really cool like melting pot of sorts of like all these different people, and from all different countries around the world, but sharing the same common mission of increasing access to rehabilitation and making that better for everyone around the world. So it was pretty cool.
I bet there were some really cool perspectives as well, because every country's health system
Handles
works
it differently.
Completely different. So I can imagine the question. What sort of questions did they ask you? Did they ask you any questions?
They did. So I basically was brought in as like a patient testimonial. So I was brought in just to share my experience with rehabilitation. So I shared a story of how I had a stroke when I was 22, completely paralyzed on my left side. So I'm hemiplegic, and I've had to go through all sorts of rehab, from cognitive, speech, physical, occupational, to learn how to walk, how to use my dominant arm and speak and swallow, and just like every form of rehab that there is, I've probably done it. So I was sharing a lot about just that journey, and specifically what I've learned about the power of mindset. Charlie, I don't know if I told you this, but I think I did actually, that I am an author, and I wrote a book specifically about this, about like what I learned about mindset to enhance our recovery journey and to overcome obstacles, whatever that may be. We might not all have a stroke or have a disability, but we all have challenges we have to deal with. And that could be moving to a new place, starting a new career, a new job. It could just be a death in the family, or like some big change. That any big change that happens to us leaves us with a choice, right? So how we may not be able to control like certain things that happen to us. Having a stroke, for instance, I couldn't control that was happening, but it did. But what I do have a choice over is how I'm going to respond to this trauma and to this situation that happened to me. So how am I going to take this experience and turn it into something positive for myself, but also for the people that I interact with, and use it as a tool to help support others in their rehabilitation journey, in their recovery, or in overcoming their obstacles. So that's, I think, one of the huge missions of mine.
I completely get that, and I completely agree. And the book was actually one of my questions that I was going to bring up today, so you brought me a nice segue that I will use. But it is so true that it is all about how the way you view yourself and your journey through it. It's so hard in those situations where something's happened to you or you've got a challenge that's come up, but it is about how you approach it, which is my mum has a famous saying that I often feel very frustrated when she says it to me, but she often says to me, worry about something when it happens. I'm a bit of a worrier. I'm always worrying about, I'm a bit of a plan freak, and I think that comes from being a wheelchair user. I like to know what's going on, what's going to happen next. That's sort of
Yes, me
what
too.
yeah. So when I have that conversation with my mum of like, oh, this big thing's happening, this big stress is happening to me, they'll go, oh, worry about it when it happens. And you're like, I would if I could, but I can't. And that can be really challenging.
That's so hard though, Charlie, because I'm also the same way, and I like create this unnecessary anxiety for myself. And
Yeah.
my parents also say like, "Oh, why worry about that? Like, worry about it when it happens." But I'd actually be curious to hear how you do that, because I find it very challenging. Like, I'm always spiraling to worst case scenario and getting anxious.
For me personally, like I again, always lean into the whole being a planner and like knowing what's going on. But I think as well, for me, it's about controlling what you can, and then everything that else is out of your control, you just have to let go. So that is the big thing that I would say to people is if you can control it, do it, because that's going to help ease that anxiety. But you need to remember there are just certain elements of these situations that you just can't control, and you have to take that approach of worry about it when it happens. Because as well,
Right.
what often happens is you build it up in your head and you go, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this massive thing that's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And then the thing that you think is going to happen happens, and you're like, oh, this isn't as bad. But then you've made 400 crisis arrangements that you now no longer need, and also you've caused unnecessary stress
Exactly.
for yourself. So it's really tricky. I think for me, it's just about trying to remember, and I'm still battling. And growing with this of trying to remember to take a step back and be like, realistically, what's going to happen. And also, I think as well, it's about, for me, it's about leaning into the people around me and going, look, I know I'm a crisis planner. I know I like to build myself up
Yes.
in my head. Let me speak to a person that's not like that, or someone who's not emotionally invested in it, to get a very real world perspective and try and listen to that. It's really hard to do that because you naturally want to go into the, oh shit, I need to get this done now. And that's what you try and need to get over, but it's really hard to do.
It is, and that's something that I actively try to work on and be better about. Actually, so my friend Chloe, who we were just talking about, that, she and I are good complements to each other, purely because she is very good at just like taking things as they go. And I'm more like you, Charlie. I'm more
Yes.
like a planner myself, and I like to know, okay, we're taking this train at this time, and then here
Yeah.
we're gonna have to leave X amount of hours early so that
Yeah.
we can get the assistance. And like, I just
Yeah.
like to plan things out. I can be pretty go with the flow with other things, but when it comes to travel specifically, I
Yeah.
unfortunately am not. And
Yeah.
one thing I tried to learn from her is to be a little more like like rolling with the punches, so to speak, and like
Yeah.
figuring things out as they go. Like, yes, you can plan to a certain extent, but there are some things, unforeseen circumstances, that we
Yeah.
really can't prepare for. An example from our recent train trip was like the strikes and the protests. Like, we
Yeah.
couldn't anticipate that was happening, or that it would be continuing to happen. And so then we just had to evolve and adapt our
Yeah.
plan in the moment and figure out a new way forward. And I feel like that's a motto for life.
Yeah, completely. And I think as well, that's something that I've been doing a lot more recently, coming from obviously being a wheelchair user. I'm a lot more accepting now of things not being necessarily perfect for me. So like, for example, when I used to travel, I used to often think like, oh no, I need a perfectly adapted room. And now while I'll always shoot for the perfectly adapted room, I've now taken a bit of a step back and gone, can I make it work? Can I make it work? If I can make it work, great. Because the benefit of that, and I know some people don't have this opportunity to do this, but for me, the benefit of that means it opens up so many doors. So I think as well, another thing I'd say to relieve anxieties, give yourself as many like skills that are going to help you in that environment, in terms of like,
Right.
if a train gets cancelled, is there a different way you can get onto the train? Is there a way that you've worked on that isn't necessarily your ideal way of doing things, but if worst came to worst, yeah. But then I suppose that links into mine and your problem of we always have to have a plan. So I suppose it doesn't quite work.
I know. And it's tough. It's something that I'm like really trying to get better at, just not being so anxious about things that literally I can't even control. And sometimes what it takes is me, like when I realize that I'm spiraling and I'm getting anxious about things, like there's literally nothing I can do about it, I have to stop, reshift my focus to think about, okay, so what are things related to this situation that I do have some control over? Like, what can I do in this moment that will make me feel less stressed about the situation, even though I can't control the situation? Like, what can I do to, make myself feel better, essentially?
Completely agree. And I try and take the exact same approach of like, as I say, for me, it's about controlling the variables that you can. So like, for example, from my side, like one anxiety inducing thing that most wheelchair users have is the whole thing of flying. Because flying equals someone else grabbing hold of your wheelchair, and it's like, oh, is that going to arrive in one piece? And
right. Are they going to like bang it up?
Yeah, so that is a problem we face sort of day to day whenever you travel on a plane. But for me, I've now sort of built a system around like trying to restrict as many obstacles for anyone handling my equipment that I can. And also I try and limit the amount of things that people need to do with it. So like, for example, for me, one thing that I always travel with, and I know you might have seen it with Chloe. Chloe has a front wheel attachment, but I have a version of that as well. But
my one, I try
and so I try and pack my hand bike down into like a large bag. So it's in a really large bag, and that gets packed down before I go anywhere, because then it's all packed down, it's ready to go, it's been padded, it's got loads of things around it to protect it, so no one's got to press any buttons with it. No one's got to do. You've literally got to pick up the bag and put it on the plane.
And carry it on.
That's all you got to do. So that's what I've tried to do as well. And it's like having things like documentation with you to prove like, this is how much my wheelchair weighs. This is how much this weighs. This is an electric attachment. This is this. So then almost preempting all the questions that you get, that's helped me massively with my pre-flight anxiety. Because I know that I've done everything in my control, because I've got a booklet that says, right, okay, this is what this does, this is what this does, this is how much this weighs. And I also, if I phone anyone or speak to anyone over emails, I take copies of that as well. And I have honestly, I get it from my mum. My mum's a finance head. So everything is like written down and perfect. It just helps me with my thinking, because I don't know about you, you're an extremely busy person. You said obviously you're an author, you're speaking at events, you're doing this, that, the other. Managing all of that in your head and then adding in travel plans as well can be really tricky. And that's another big issue. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so actually a lot of people do ask me like, oh, how are you able to like travel, work a full-time job, like do like your activities of daily living, and go out and just do things. And I'll be honest, I don't really have the best answer for that. I will say, after I had the stroke and I became completely paralyzed on my left side, my therapists were asking me, okay, so what like goals do you have? And for me, okay, there were big, like more obvious goals, like learn how to sit up in a wheelchair, learn how to walk with a cane, learn how to walk with a brace or like some form of mobility aid, like bigger goals. But then as I began to hit those goals, it became a little harder to think of like, okay, what can I do next to continue progressing? Because I know I'm not nothing near where I was. But like now that I get off like the big milestones, it's like, how do I figure out what's next. And sorry, I lost the train of thought with what the original question was. I was going somewhere and then I forgot what
That's
the
all
question
right.
was.
We were talking about manage. It's how you manage so much of it. So you've gone through rehab. You now have this big platform that you have. You're writing. You've written a book. You've holding down a full-time job. And how do you sort of manage all of that? Particularly as we both said, we're both very much planners and like to know what's going on. But managing that much in one person's head, speaking from experience on my side of things as well, it's a lot.
It is. It's not easy, that's for sure. And I mean, I thrive personally on being quite busy and like having a lot to do. I feel like that's where I'm kind of in my zone, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I like having like a bunch of things to do. Like that busyness, but not just busyness with anything, busyness on projects and collaborations that are important to me or that I feel like will have a positive impact on my audience or my people I know or myself. So that's kind of how I figure out like where to focus my energies, because I don't have unlimited energy. Like I do get tired probably more so than like a person who has not had a stroke or gone through rehab or anything like that. Like I probably do get a little more tired than the normal person. So it's a balancing act, definitely, like figuring out, okay, what do I have the energy to do today? What's the most important thing? And if there's only one thing that I do today, what is that going to be? And then I have to make sure I do that well.
I think that's a really good way to. It's like the little voice in my head that I try and use all the time, because I'm not not to your extent. I feel like you work on some amazing stuff that I'm like, whoa, okay, I wouldn't know how to cope with that. But I think my rule that I always have is move, like being a bit of a gym head. The little voice in my head goes, move the weight a little bit every day. So that is the rule. So like, as long as I'm moving in the right direction every day, it doesn't matter if I've done an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, as long as I've
you keep showing
moved the
up.
weight. Yeah, completely. And that's what I think I would say to people, anyone going through rehab and going through sort of getting in a position where they're stronger and trying to push to where they used to be. So like, actually, this probably is a good example. So like for me, although I haven't been through what you have been through, so I had a surgery when I was 12 years old in actually the US. I had it in St. Louis, Missouri, and basically they essentially they severed the nerves in my spine that were sending the wrong signals to my brain, and because of that, it took away my spasticity, which was what I was using to hold myself up. So it'd be what I used to hold my head up, hold my neck up, hold my chest up, talk to people. It would be all of that. And then, so imagine someone's pulled that plug out of you and then they say, right, now use your muscles to do all of that. But I didn't have the strength to do it. So like, I had to completely rewire the way I was thinking, rewire the way I was doing things. Like, probably the best example of how much it impacted me was one. I remember being in the hospital, just being allowed to sit up for the first time after my surgery, and I went to go to the toilet, and I sat on the toilet, and basically I couldn't even hold my head up. So I had to get my dad to sit in front of me and let me lean on him because I couldn't hold my head up. So that was what I went through. And then the other thing was I am a keen swimmer, and grew into it because of the operation. But at the time, I'd had the operation, and then 6 weeks had gone by, and my dad was like, oh, great, you're allowed in the swimming pool now. And we went down to the swimming pool, and he put me in the swimming pool, and I sank to the bottom because I didn't know how to swim anymore, because the way I used to swim was because of my spasticity. So like, so I sank to the bottom, and then Dad looked down and was like, okay, I've got to go get him, because otherwise we're going to have a problem. But the reason why I'm giving these examples is like, so though that in that situation, I was looking at what I had to do to get back to where I was, if not better. It felt like such a daunting task to really like tackle.
Definitely.
That. And I think that's where I almost wish I had the mindset I have now back then of just keep moving the buck. If you can keep moving it, you'll eventually get there. It doesn't matter when you get there, as long as you do it in your own time and you're comfortable doing it. Because a lot of the time,
Exactly.
particularly with
And
rehab and sport, you can push yourself too fast and then end up injured or almost causing a problem, which then pushes you back.
yeah, no, definitely. And I think that goes along with what we were saying before about just keep showing up, keep putting in the effort to achieve those goals, be it through sport, through rehab, whatever like the goals are. It is important to just keep going after it, because progress doesn't happen overnight, as we all here know. Like, it does
Yeah.
take time and repetition and effort and consistency, but over time that all adds up.
Definitely. Coming back to because we realised we haven't actually spoken about at all this in this episode. What was your journey like? So, can you sort of give people a snapshot of your journey this far with your stroke, what the recovery was like, and how it sort of impacted you? You've briefly touched on it at the beginning of the episode, but we actually haven't done a deep dive into it, if that's okay.
Yeah, I can give so the quick little explanation of it is, ever since I was like 7 years old, I've been getting super terrible, debilitating migraines where I would be just completely out. I could not go to school. I couldn't do anything. I just have to lay down in like a dark room and vomit. Like, there was nothing. No medicine made me feel better. Eventually, when I was 15 years old, I had a migraine that lasted like 24 days. And my neurologist said to me, "This is not normal. We need you to have an MRI scan to figure out if there's something else going on." The MRI revealed that I had what is called an arteriovenous malformation in the right occipital lobe of my brain. They call it an AVM for short, and what that is basically a tangle of abnormal blood vessels that don't have capillaries. So blood flow is like extremely unregulated, potentially dangerous. So I learned that with each year of life is an increased chance that the AVM could rupture. If it ruptures, I could have a stroke, I could die. And if it ruptured, it's like a 50% chance of it rupturing. And if it did rupture, a 10% chance of death. So personally, me being like a young high school student, I did not like hearing that. So I said, I
No,
need to get this thing taken out
yeah.
immediately. So I consulted lots of neurosurgeons. Half of them said it was too big to take out. They couldn't do it. Others said, this is so big, you need to get it taken out immediately. So eventually I decided, once I finished my college degree, I was going to get the brain surgery to get rid of this risk of stroke and death. Excuse me. So I went into the hospital 1 week after I graduated from university. They had to do preoperative procedure because it was so big. The pre-op caused a blood clot, which burst, causing me to have a massive stroke in the hospital. And they're like, the neurosurgeon has to be called back in. They're not sure if I'm even going to make it out of this alive. And if I do, if I would be able to do anything at all. So that was not a good it's really not looking good for Maddi.
Yeah.
Although thankfully they were able to stop the bleeding, remove the AVM, I just woke up completely paralyzed on the left side of my body. So everything from my arm, my leg, the left side of my body, my left side of my face, I couldn't speak, I couldn't swallow, like everything. I was like a baby again. I had to learn how to do everything. So I did physical, occupational, speech, cognitive therapy, all of it. Super intense for like 2 years. I learned how to sit in a wheelchair. Then I learned how to walk with a cane. Then I learned how to walk with no cane, but wearing like a brace, or like I'll also wear Bioness. So I have a mobility aid, but now I don't use the cane anymore. But my left arm is still a little slow to make progress. It has come a long way, but it's not as functional as I would like it to be. So I still have ways to go with that. I wrote 2 books during the time that I was going through rehab that I wasn't working. And the first book was about fashion because I wanted to get into the industry, but realized I didn't know anything about it or have experience. So I just started networking with people, wrote my findings into a book. But I also talked about how I was using the book as a tool in my cognitive rehabilitation because I don't know if any listeners have gone through cognitive therapy, but it sucks. And it just feels
Yeah.
stupid. It just feels like dumb. Like, why am I doing these dumb, like, little puzzles and games? Like, I don't need to be doing this. But by writing a book, it felt like I was doing something more with a purpose that had, like,
Yep.
more related to what I wanted to do, like, with my life. And
Yep.
people liked that I talked about my personal journey in that book. So then I wrote a second book specifically about my recovery experience and what I learned from that.
That's crazy. The like that just that just is the testament to what we said earlier of always keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. Like
Exactly.
most people in your situation wouldn't even, and I can imagine you didn't either at the time, wouldn't even know where to start in that situation after waking up after your stroke. You must have been like,
Literally. And me neither. But if I can do
yeah,
it,
I can't believe like what was it like, because it must have been really frustrating for you sort of waking up and realizing that you couldn't do certain things that you'd be able to do really easily before. Like that was one of my big frustrations from my major surgery, and mine wasn't to the extent of what happened to you. So like I can imagine the frustration must have been really challenging.
very frustrating. And I definitely initially went through like a few months of denial, kind of, where I just thought like, oh, this isn't like really my life. Like, I'm just going to wake up one day and like everything will be better. Like, I'll be able to walk. I'll be using my hand again. But I quickly realized that that was not the case. And I was not going to make I wasn't just going to regain these functions and abilities that I had had before. Like, the
Yeah.
only way I was going to is if I listened to my therapist and did the rehab, which kind of stinks, but
Yep.
I realized I wanted to put in the effort. I wanted to see where I could go with this, and it's turned into something bigger and more bigger than me at this point. Like, now I'm passionate about connecting the stroke and the disability community. I'm passionate about sharing my story to help others, amplify the voices of others, and empower them to share their journeys and help others in the process. So I feel like it's turned into a bigger mission.
This is what I often bring up on this podcast, and in that is the topic of like people often ask, would you hand back what happened to you, whether that be a disability or stroke or something like that? And my answer is really weird because so my story is basically I stopped breathing at 4 weeks old, and because of that, because of lack of air to the brain, I
Wow.
got cerebral palsy. So that's my story, and loads of people go, oh, but that is, I suppose, preventable. And would you, like, if you had the opportunity now, would you go back and change it? And my answer is always the same. My answer, which shocks a lot of people, is no, I wouldn't hand mine back because it's made me the person that I am today, also given me the opportunities that I've been given up until this point, and made me appreciate a lot of things that not necessarily I would have before, and also met some amazing people that I wouldn't have met if
Yeah.
these things didn't happen. And then also, the other thing to remember is everyone knows the saying, it's better the devil you know, because none of us know what our lives would be like if these events didn't happen. So we could go back, do it, and then go, oh, I really don't like this. But then also, we wouldn't have known, we don't know what it would have been like anyway. So it makes no difference, if that makes any
I agree.
sense.
And I also agree in the sense that, like, I don't think I would go back and change it. Maybe if you asked me like 6 years ago, right after it happened, yes. But you're right. I wouldn't have
Yeah.
met half of the people I know now. I wouldn't have built this community. I wouldn't have become engaged with all these new friends, and wouldn't have written my books. I wouldn't have worked I wouldn't have ended up working in fashion like I do now. Like, there's just so many things. I probably wouldn't have traveled to half the places I've been to. And
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, there's no way to know if, had none of this ever happened to us, would we have still done the things that we've done today? There's no way to know
Yeah.
if we would have or not. But it's kind of like, so something that you and I were talking about, Charlie, right before we hopped on this podcast was about the things you can control versus what's out of your control, and still getting
Yeah.
anxious about things that are beyond our control, that we have no way of knowing what's going to happen. And it
Yeah.
speaks to us like being able to adapt and evolve and basically, adapt ourselves to the situations that come our way. We don't always know what's going to happen. It could be a stroke. It could be, I don't know, some terrible disease or whatever it is. But what are we going to do about that? Like, in a way, it's like, is it worth it for us to even, at least the way I think, like, is it worth it for me to even waste my precious time thinking about, oh, what if this never happened? Because it's not what happened. Like, this did happen.
Yeah.
So I don't want to spend my time daydreaming or thinking about like, oh, like, well, what if it didn't? Because that's not going to help me move forward.
Yeah. The other thing that I always find surprising, and I've had this happen personally to me as well, is like this common misconception that anyone that's gone through any similar struggle to us has, like, I'm just going to come out and say it. I've had the question asked to me of like, how are you so happy? And I'm like, well, there's a lot to unpack there. Like,
that's a big question.
Yeah, and it's a big question, but also it's the common assumption that like you can't be happy in these situations that we find ourselves in. But like it's like we say, you either you get on with it or you don't. Like you have no choice. And sometimes I'm like,
exactly, you have to find a way.
Exactly, and it's really hard to explain because there are a lot of people who are maybe outside of the same community and outside of this community that we're in often think like, oh, I wouldn't be able to manage in that scenario. But then often the thing that you have to remind them is, but you kind of just have to, because it's like your choices are very limited of I either get on with this or I let it beat me.
No, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, Charlie, because a lot of people also come to me and they say like, wow, I don't think I could be as brave as you. Like, I don't think I would be able to do what you're doing. And I say to them, it's one of these things that until it happens to you, until you're personally tested with it, you don't know. And when you are, you'll realize like, there's no other choice. Like, I either find a way to move forward from this, find a way to move on, or nothing, and it can be a tricky moment.
I think and another big challenge that comes with that is like one of the misconceptions that I get all the time is that people will see me out doing quote unquote normal things. And by normal things, they mean they see me out with my friends, they see me traveling with my friends or my partner, and they see me. The one that's always really odd is they'll see me like in a bar having a few drinks with friends. And I always get the one guy that's like, oh, wow, you're out with friends. And I'm like, yeah, what am I meant to be doing?
As are you, so.
Yeah. It's always really strange because people think like we're almost locked in basements somewhere and like we don't go out, we don't have friends, we don't have social lives. It's really weird.
Or that we can't do
I honestly don't know where it comes from.
I don't know where that conception comes from, but I get that a lot too. It's like they almost, because something so bad, so to speak, happened to me, people then think like, oh, like they're surprised to see me traveling on my own, living my life, working a full-time job. They're like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Like you should just be happy, that you're alive, which I am, but I refuse to settle, Charlie. And
also, you've got, like, unfortunately, to do all these things, we have to make money. Unfortunately, that is a thing. It's
just like anyone else.
Yeah. We have bills we got to pay.
No, exactly. So yeah, it is. I don't understand when people, well, whatever. But yeah, it's kind of weird. And I don't know why people say things like that.
The other thing I'd love to point out as well that often people forget, particularly I say those that are outside of the community, is reminding people that actually you've got a much higher chance of joining the community rather than us exiting the community, if that's the right way to
No,
phrase
exactly.
it.
Think of how many people with disabilities there are in, I think like in America, I think it's like 1 in 4 people will like be disabled at some point in their life, which is like a lot of people.
I always joke and say that at least if when I turn 80, 40 years old, I'm just going to be good at it. I'm just going to be good at
Exactly.
this
You have
whole
lots of practice.
wheelchair, crutches. I can do anything. It's fine by me. But it is really interesting to look at the way that people view the disabled community and the way that they almost pity it. What's your view on like? I'm really big on don't pity people, and particularly don't pity. Like I really don't like it with me when people go, "Oh, is he okay? Does he know what he's doing?" That's the bit where I'm like,
Yes.
we're just average Joes that just happen to have some things happen to us, which means that we have to live our lives in a slightly different way. So have you come across anything like that in terms of, as I say, people treating you very differently to how they would treat another individual?
Yes. Oh no, definitely. I do find that like sometimes when I meet new people and maybe they like they'll ask like, oh, like what happened, or like, are you okay to be doing that, or whatever. Like, I mean, a part of me appreciates the concern. Like if someone's like, I do appreciate it when I'm out with friends and we're walking down the street and my friend says, oh, by the way, there's a big step down, like watch your step, like things like that. I do
Yeah,
appreciate personally. I know
yeah,
maybe not everyone does, like, but I do like when like people look out for me and are aware of like things that might be more challenging for me and are there to help. But I do notice that like people, to get back to your point, that sometimes people make like not good assumptions, and
yeah.
that can be harmful.
It's really hard as well because sometimes those situations can be made with the best intentions, but they've just come across
Exactly.
in the completely wrong way. Like, for example, so one of my big things, the reason why my brand's called Not Quite Politically Correct is I'm very of the belief of like, look, say it how it is, say it how you think it, and then we can fix it afterwards. Don't worry about, are you going to offend me? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do? I will help you through that minefield. Get the questions out that you need to ask. And I think that's the other thing as well. It's about people realizing that most of the disabled community, we're very used to being asked about our conditions, our differences, X, Y, Z.
Right.
So because of that, we are very used to that exchange of teaching someone about our certain
Yeah, and like the
situation.
interrogation.
Yeah, so we're very used to that. So don't go in with this whole we don't know what's going on, because a lot of us know a lot more about it than you're going to. So allow us to teach you. And I think I'm always very grateful for the opportunity to educate someone on something that they wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to before. Like, I love people's realization of like, oh, it was challenging for you to get into employment. And I'm like, yes, like, why, like, I love how this is a big shock to you. Like this, yeah, it would be, because we're still working on building things like that. And it's the same when it comes to travel, as we spoke about earlier. Like, people don't realize that there are so many different things that we have to consider when it comes to travel, and when it comes to our planning of that and what that's going to look like and things like that. People just assume, oh, they have to make reasonable adjustments for you, and you're like, no, that's not the world that we live in, unfortunately. I'd love it to be,
Unfortunately.
but
Not yet.
unfortunately, no. One day we will get there.
Exactly. That's why we do what we do, right? So we can get one step closer.
Exactly, and people do ask that. People go, "Oh, why? Like, do you think?" And I've been asked this before. Do you think we're going to get there in your lifetime? And I've actually come to I don't know what your view on this. It'd be really interesting to get your view. But my view is, I don't think we will get there in my lifetime. But at least I can say that I pushed. It comes back to our point earlier. At least I can say I pushed it forward. I made steps in the right direction, and
I
that is.
actually agree. I agree completely with that statement because I think I don't know, maybe it's my like more dismal outlook, but I don't think we will either. But also, like, if I can play one small role in furthering the accessibility agenda for people with disabilities and just in general our society, like, I think that's a step in the right direction. And that's all it takes is like these building blocks to stack up. And then eventually it will happen. But it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily you or me having a dismal outlook. I would argue that it has a realistic outlook of the way
That's a
how
better
far.
way to put it. Yes, a realistic
Yeah,
outlook.
because a realistic outlook, because look, it's like it sounds quite negative, but one thing that I always think is like it creates less disappointment if you expect it not to be perfect. Because I often find that with anything with disability, like very rarely do you find yourself in perfect situations. So like I take everything with a pinch of salt. So like, for example, if a restaurant says to me, "Oh, we're fully wheelchair accessible," until I'm there and I'm sat in the seat, I don't believe a word.
Right, right.
And that can sometimes come across as like quite, oh, but you take like you have a bad view on like the world. And no, it comes back to my point of it all comes down to people's understanding of things. Like, for example, by that I mean like wheelchair accessibility means one thing to one person and another thing to another. So, for example, Karen, who's never met a disabled person, goes, "Oh yeah, our restaurant's wheelchair accessible, but there's one step that you need to get over. It's not wheelchair accessible." Or
Yeah.
then you get someone so they might have a cousin that's in a wheelchair and they answer the phone and go, "Okay, we're not we're wheelchair accessible in terms of we've got level access into the restaurant, but we haven't got an accessible toilet for you. But the toilet is possible if you're able to get out of your chair." So those scenarios are very different and the answers are very different, but that is because someone has more information than the other person, and that's what I think you and me are here to do. The more people that
Exactly.
have the
So it's also
information,
about like just increasing that exposure to
yes.
society to know, like, to understand that like these accessibility needs are important for everyone to consider, not just for people who have disabilities, not just for someone who's in a wheelchair, has a brace or whatever. Like it affects our entire society, entire world.
And I think another thing to that point is when it comes to accessibility information and advising someone, also it's much better for you to turn around to someone and go, "Look, our establishment isn't wheelchair accessible. I'd much rather you do that and say, 'Look, unfortunately it's not,' and then I can move on to the next one." Don't start going, "Oh, we sort of are, but like if you can do a few steps, you can get it." No,
Yeah.
just don't overcomplicate
Exactly. That's
it.
not wheelchair accessible then.
Yeah, exactly. But it's as we've said, it's making steps in the right direction. We've done some amazing things here in the UK. We've made steps in the right direction. Particularly, we've spoke about trains earlier. That's slowly getting better. We've just had a new underground system put in place that's fully, as far as I'm aware, it's fully wheelchair accessible. It's roll on, roll off, which is one of the nicest feelings. It's like a
Oh,
nice new
nice.
carpet. It's that whole thing of like, I haven't got to be stressed about anything. I can just go to the station, get on the train, and get off where I need to go.
Roll
I've
right
got
on. No
this.
awkward little step.
Yep. And so we are making progress. What would you say is an area that the US are doing quite well in at the moment?
I mean, to be honest, I think it kind of varies depending on like what specifically we're talking about. I will say
Yep.
I live right outside New York City, And New York, I think, is overall like pretty good with accessibility. That being said, I will say a lot of the apartments, if they're older buildings, and you mentioned this, it's same in the UK, then they don't have an elevator. They don't have like a railing for the steps. So like it is definitely like challenging to access. But
Yeah.
it's like the buildings are just so old that I don't know. Although it is a requirement to follow of the ADA to have like the railings or to have like an elevator or something like that. But I don't know. It seems like a lot of the older buildings maybe just don't follow that, or maybe no one's called them out on it. So I don't know.
It's often, I don't know whether it's the same in the US, it's often that there's a little legal loophole that means they don't have to worry about
Right.
it.
Yeah,
And
that could be.
it's the most ridiculous. So one of the big areas that does need improving in the UK, and I think this is probably across the board anywhere, is when it comes to housing and accommodation. So in terms of whether you're in an apartment, house, whatever that might be, accessibility is a big challenge. So that's a common thing across the board. Even here, we have that issue, and there's often like little rules in the law here that say like if it's financially harmful or like this, that, the other, then they don't have to do it, and that's often what people rely on in that respect. But it's interesting, as I say, it's nice to know. I think particularly New York being quite a similar sort of main city, similar to London, it's nice to know that they're making steps in the right direction as well. Because as we said earlier, in my head, I'd had very mixed reviews about New York, so it's nice to hear that they're doing okay.
Yeah, no, it has its ups and downs, but I would say overall things look pretty good. But like I said, there's always areas for improvement.
There's always going to be, and that's the best places for innovation. The best products that we have and the best things that we have are just constantly being improved. So I suppose that's something we're never going to get away from. One thing I do want to ask is that obviously you had this life-changing thing happen to you. What then inspired you to go, do you know what, I'm going to share my journey with people? I know you said about with your book, it was a case of you shared your thoughts and everything, but also use it as like almost a recovery exercise. But what made you want to dive into social media and really share that journey?
So that actually started because I mentioned the feedback I got from my first book. So when I decided that I wanted to write a book about the lessons of mindset and what I've learned through my recovery journey and how that's like positively impacted me, because I realized that a lot of people are interested in that topic and want to hear about it, I thought, why don't I start connecting with other people who are in a similar situation to me or who know someone who is? And I was like, you know what, I'll just start putting my thoughts on social media and reaching out to people on there. And so that's how it started and grew.
100, yeah. I think you're on about 100,000, coming up to 100,000 on Instagram.
Almost, yes.
Yeah, I'd be itching to get to that number. I'm one of the people that I get close to it. I'm like, I really want to get past that number. But it's amazing that like you've taken it as like it's really been like a journey for you in terms of really sharing that with the community. Like most people, I would imagine, would find those scenarios very challenging in terms of not wanting to divulge their personal life and share that with the world. But it's quite nice to see that, like.
But I see it as it's bigger than just me, you know, and that's how I see it. It's like I'm sharing my journey for myself, but also to help and empower other people. And to me, that's more important. So if I can help someone else by putting my journey out there and helping others, then it's all worth it.
I completely agree, and it's very similar to what I do. Of like one of my favorite things I get is whenever I get the little messages saying, "Oh, you've really helped me because my son's just been diagnosed with cerebral palsy," or "Oh, I didn't know how to do this certain task. Your video to help me realize how I can do it." I love those little messages. Like it is. Yeah, those are the ones where it makes it all worth it. Because I think I was speaking about on another podcast, another episode, where oftentimes as a content creator, you can get a little bit wrapped up in the numbers. You can get a little bit wrapped up in am I reaching my audience? Is this doing well? Is that doing well? Should I be doing this? Should I jump onto this platform? And it can get very I can't get the word out. Strategic, and it can be very like numbers driven. So those scenarios where it's really helping real people can really like reinforce that I'm doing something that's good for the wider community and helping someone. And even if I manage to help 10 people over the course of me doing it, I've made a good impact.
Exactly. And I also try not to focus on like the numbers or the stats and just focus more on like the connections with the people that I make through social media and helping them. Because that's obviously what's more important.
Have you faced much negativity when it comes to social media?
Not too much. I mean, there's always like the occasional like comment on something, but overall, I would say no.
That's really good to hear. And as I say, it's very similar to me of people ask, like, have I had like any major bad comments? And it's very minimal. Like, I think oftentimes with the social media, obviously the negativity sells of, oh, social media is a bad thing because people are just trolling people and that becomes a whole discussion. But I've actually not experienced much of it, and almost any of it that I have experienced, it's just kind of laughable because it's just to sit there and go, what? Like, one of the ones that I had was, it was a photo of me and my girlfriend, and they commented and going, it was just, but he can't walk. And I'm like, correct, you are correct. I don't know what you want me to say. Like, that's factually correct. What were you trying to achieve?
Yeah, exactly. Some people just, it's dumb, and comments like that, like, it's not worth your engagement.
But I think as well, the only time I do worry about comments like that is if someone's at the beginning of their journey with their disability, then those ones can be quite impactful. And the best piece of advice I'd give for that is just, as hard as it can be, just ignore it and move on, because they're not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth the energy. But it's nice to hear as well, as someone with a bigger following, it's nice to hear that you haven't experienced much of it. Now, obviously, you have built quite a big following, because I do wonder, the bigger you get, do you face more criticism? So that's really nice to hear that it's still quite minimal from your experience.
Yeah, I would say pretty minimal.
That's
Hopefully
amazing.
It stays that way.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. What made you dive into the fashion industry?
I had always really wanted to be in fashion, but when after I had the stroke and everything, I thought, who would ever hire me? I have no experience in the industry. And so that was kind of like the impetus for me to start writing my book on the topic, just to start having conversations with people in the industry. And my first job was actually completely unrelated. It was as an underwriter in reinsurance for a Spanish company. But that was a great experience, and I did gain skills there that I was able to leverage into transitioning a career into fashion. And so I've loved it. I really do enjoy it.
That's amazing. So what was the journey like transitioning careers? Like, because that's quite a big change to go from underwriting to hard cut fashion.
And I did enjoy underwriting, to be honest. So like, I really liked it, but I kept coming back to that thoughts of like, what if I never took this leap and tried to like transition into something that I think I might really enjoy. And so then I ultimately just decided to go for it and haven't looked back.
That's amazing. But that's really nice to hear as well, because I feel like particularly big changes when you have a disability can often feel extra daunting, but also particularly when it comes to the employment side of things, we can feel a little bit more restricted in the opportunities that we get. Obviously, that is getting better, as we've said before, but it can feel very nerve-wracking, because you're like, oh, what if I'm not accepted by this industry because of my differences or because of my conditions? So it's really nice to hear that you kind of made the leap, and I can't imagine it's not been smooth sailing. I'm not saying it would have been, but it's nice to hear that you're in a good space now.
That it can be done. And then, anything is possible. I think that's a great note to add in there. Like, my journey with disability and with the stroke has been just proving and showing to myself that I am capable of so much more than I thought that I was. And I don't let anything stop me.
Exactly. And I think as well, any person has to adapt their careers. Their careers adapt over time because the industry that they work in changes. Like, one example that I always give is when I started content creating in social media, I wanted to be a fitness YouTuber. That was why I started content creating. Then what basically happened was I got involved in the disabled community, noticed that there was loads of other topics I wanted to speak on that weren't necessarily fitness related, were more sort of in the world of disability and improving things for people. So then my outlook and what I was trying to achieve changed. But then, like, NQPC just grew with me, and I went in a different direction. And people can do that with their careers. Like, you might start in one thing, think this isn't for me, and move on to the next and love it. Like, like we've seen with Maddi.
We blaze a new path forward.
Exactly. And I think as well, what would one piece of advice be that you would give to a young stroke survivor like yourself if someone came up to you and said, what do I do next? What would be your advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I said a little earlier in this episode, I would say, like, keep showing up. Like, the progress is not going to happen just like overnight. Like, it's all these exercises, all these repetitions and efforts that you put in compound upon each other and translate over time to change. And so I would say just keep your focus, keep putting in your repetitions and your effort, and you'll be surprised. Film yourself today and film yourself 6 months from now. I think you'll be surprised by the changes that you see.
Completely agree. And like, it's when I think back to like 15-year-old Charlie, and I'm like, if you said to me when I was 15 I'd be doing the stuff that I'm doing now, I would have called you absolutely crackers. I would have been like, yep, you've made that up. You're a liar. Who are you? Whereas
No, exactly.
It's just a journey, and you kind of have to just go with it. And it's like what we spoke about earlier of like building that resilience of being able to go with the punches, go with the flow, but also control what you can. Now that sounds really backwards and doesn't work together, but the more you can find a rhythm between those three things, the better your experience is going to be.
I agree. I think that's a good ending little note.
And on that note, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to ask the last question, which I did pre-warn Maddi about at the beginning of the episode, and she was a little bit nervous. She was a tiny bit nervous.
I am nervous, but let's go for it. We'll see what comes out.
We're going to do it. And that is, what's one piece of politically correctness that you really strongly agree with or disagree with? It doesn't have to be disability related. It can be anything. It's more of what really makes you tick, or what's an area that you're really passionate about that you wish you could just speak your mind on.
So something did just come to my mind, but I'm afraid it's not really, it's not quite relevant, but I'm going to say it anyways. I don't understand society's obsession with Taylor Swift. I simply do not.
Like, I get it. I don't get the obsession.
You agree with me? Like, why is everyone so obsessed with her? Why are you paying like $1,000 to see her in concert? Like, I would see her if someone gave me a ticket, but like, I'm sorry, her music after like 2013, in my opinion, kind of went downhill, and I don't really care.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, she's exceptionally talented. I give her that, but I don't see her as a groundbreaking artist.
Me
and that sounds really mean. Like, she's extremely talented.
Mean, You said it didn't have to be politically correct, so I'm saying
it's perfect. It's exactly what we want, but it is so true. Like, she's extremely talented. It's just, I'm with you. I don't get the hype.
Okay, good.
Oh
my God, I hope we don't get a lot of comments on this episode being like, oh, they're hating on Taylor Swift.
I'm just going to title it, Maddi Hates Taylor Swift.
You know what you're in for then. When you listen to this.
But I have to say, I think that's one of my favourite answers. Because I completely get it. I
don't get the obsession. She's just not really for me, but whatever.
But I also don't get when artists have that much of a, it's hard to phrase, but like how artists have that much of an impact where people are so passionate about it. Like, I can't think of
that good. Like, it just seems very like anything else. I don't know what the right phrase is, but
no, I know what you mean. Like it's very samey, if you get what I mean. Yeah, I completely agree.
She's not my cup of tea.
Completely agree. And on that note, where can people find you? I always give my guests a chance to plug themselves, let people know where they can find you. Obviously, we've talked about your books a lot in this episode. So where can people check out your book or books? And just your opportunity to tell us where to find you.
Yeah. So my books are on Amazon. The one about my recovery is called Fast Forward, The Fully Recovered Mindset, and it's abbreviated FWD. So you can check that out. I'm quite active on social media, as we were mentioning, so connect with me on Instagram. That's my primary platform. It is at Maddi Stroke of Luck. So MADDI STROKEOFLUCK. And you can email me, I think, through my profile too. So email is usually a good way to get in touch. But you'll see all of that on my profile. I think those are the best ways to contact me.
The main ones. And I think as well, from there you can go off in different areas.
Exactly.
And you can, So, no, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been so nice to chat to you. I feel like we could chat for hours. We could chat about loads of different topics.
We could go on and on, but I know we're already over an hour.
That's fine. What we'll do is we'll see if we can get an episode 2 booked in, because I think there's loads of things we didn't touch on, and I'm always intrigued as well to almost compare the differences between the UK and US whenever I have US guests on. So I would love to have you on for episode 2, but we will sort it out. But thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Charlie, for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Not Quite Podcast. Please make sure you follow us on TikTok and Instagram to get regular updates about the podcast.
These my dollars make it hurt.